Drake Wilson had collected debts from some unsavory characters before, but nothing in his 7 years as a recovery specialist had prepared him for this. The address on his tablet led to an unassuming warehouse in the industrial district. Supposedly, one Mr. Gareth Finch owed Northeast Financial Services a cool $37,000 for a business loan he'd stopped paying 6 months ago. Drake checked the address again. This was definitely the place. Another day, another deadbeat, he muttered, straightening his tie. Drake preferred the term recovery specialist to debt collector. It sounded more professional, and professionalism was key. No threats, no baseball bats, just the steady pressure of paperwork and persistence. The warehouse door was unlocked. Strange. Drake pushed it open cautiously and stepped into darkness that suddenly gave way to an eerie blue light. The warehouse interior had been transformed. Gone were the expected storage shelves and forklifts. Instead, a circular chamber with gleaming metallic walls hummed with energy. In the center stood a group of figures in shimmering attire that definitely wasn't standard business casual. I'm looking for Gareth Finch." Drake's voice echoed more than it should have in a space this size. The figures turned. They were humanoid but definitely not human. Silvery skin, large almond-shaped eyes, and what appeared to be gills pulsing gently on their necks. One stepped forward, a tall being with elaborate markings across its face. "The bounty hunter arrives precisely when expected," it said in perfect English, though the voice had an odd harmonizing quality that made Drake's fillings vibrate. "Your reputation precedes you. There's been a mistake." Drake took a step back, his mind racing. Aliens. Actual aliens. In a warehouse in New Jersey. "I'm just here about an overdue loan." The alien tilted its head. "Your modesty is unnecessary. The Galactic Consortium appreciates your discretion in capturing the fugitive Zorn. As agreed, payment will be rendered." Before Drake could protest further, the group parted to reveal another figure. This one was shorter, with pale blue skin and what looked like crystalline patterns embedded in her arms. Her eyes were deep violet, pupil-less, and currently glaring at Drake with undisguised contempt. "This is Princess Talia of the Azuran Royal House," the leader announced. "As per our arrangement, she is now in your custody until the blockade of her homeworld is lifted." The princess spoke, her voice like wind chimes but with a definite edge. "This is outrageous. I demand to speak with my embassy." "Wait, I don't want a princess," Drake protested, holding up his hands. "I just want Mr. Finch to pay his debt." The leader's expression didn't change. The universal translator must be malfunctioning. Regardless, the exchange is complete. He handed Drake what looked like a glowing business card. "Your compensation, plus the custody bond for the royal. The embassy will contact you when arrangements for her return are finalized." "But we thank you for your service." The criminal Zorn would have caused untold damage if allowed to proceed with his plans. The leader made a gesture that might have been a salute. "When the blockade ends, you will be handsomely rewarded by the Azuran government." Before Drake could object again, a humming sound filled the air. The aliens, except for the princess, began to shimmer and fade. "No, wait. You can't just." They vanished, leaving Drake alone with the glowering alien princess. "This is kidnapping," she hissed, those violet eyes narrowing. "Do you have any idea what my people will do to your pitiful planet when they discover I'm being held captive?" Drake stared at her, then at the glowing card in his hand, then back at the empty space where the aliens had been. "Lady, I'm just trying to collect a debt," he sighed, already anticipating the difficulty of explaining this to his boss. "But I think I just became part of something much bigger than a defaulted loan." The princess crossed her arms. "You're not a real bounty hunter, are you?" "I hunt people who don't pay their bills," Drake replied wearily. "Does that count?" From outside came the sound of approaching sirens. Apparently, whatever cloaking technology had kept this place hidden was no longer operational. Perfect, Drake muttered. Just perfect. This dwelling is completely inadequate for someone of my status, Princess Talia declared, examining Drake's one-bedroom apartment with obvious disgust. She ran a finger along his bookshelf, inspecting the thin layer of dust. Do you not employ servants? Drake rubbed his temples, trying to fend off the headache that had been building since their narrow escape from the warehouse. They'd barely avoided the police, slipping out through a back exit moments before officers swarmed the place. For the 100th time, I'm not your captor. I'm a victim of circumstance, just like you. He collapsed onto his worn couch. And no, I don't have servants. Normal people on Earth clean their own homes, when they have time. Primitive, Talia muttered, poking suspiciously at his television remote. When she pressed a button and the screen flared to life, she jumped back, hand reflexively reaching for something at her hip that wasn't there. It's just TV, Drake explained tiredly. Entertainment. Not a weapon. The princess composed herself quickly. I was merely startled by your crude technology. She straightened her iridescent garment, which shimmered with colors that seemed to shift depending on the angle of light. On Azura, our entertainment systems respond to thought patterns, not physical manipulation. Well, welcome to Earth, Your Highness, Drake said, voice heavy with sarcasm. Where we still push buttons and I have to be at work tomorrow morning. The reality of his situation was sinking in. How exactly was he supposed to explain an alien princess to his boss? Sorry, I didn't collect the Finch debt, but I accidentally kidnapped royalty from another planet instead? Talia paced the small living room, her movements fluid despite her obvious agitation. I must contact my embassy immediately. The diplomatic consequences of this blunder could be catastrophic. Great idea, Drake said, brightening. Call your people and clear this up. I'll drive you to your embassy first thing tomorrow. The princess's expression darkened. That's not possible. Did you not hear mention of the blockade? My homeworld is currently under restrictions imposed by the Galactic Consortium due to internal political matters. She looked away. My presence on Earth was not entirely official. So you're telling me you're some kind of illegal alien? Drake laughed at his own joke, then quickly sobered when Talia glared at him. Sorry. But seriously, there must be someone we can contact. There are protocols for emergencies, she admitted reluctantly. But utilizing them would alert certain factions to my whereabouts, which would be problematic. Drake leaned forward. What kind of problematic are we talking about? The kind that might result in your primitive dwelling being reduced to atomic particles. Talia examined her crystalline fingernails. There are those who would prefer I not return to Azura alive. Terrific, Drake muttered. So I'm harboring a fugitive alien princess with assassins potentially on her tail. He stood up, heading for the kitchen. I need a drink. Talia followed him, watching curiously as he poured himself a whiskey. Your recovery skills must be exceptional for the consortium to entrust you with my custody. Though your living conditions suggest otherwise. Drake downed his drink in one gulp, welcoming the burn. I'm not a bounty hunter. I'm a debt collector. I track down people who don't pay their bills and convince them to settle their accounts. You hunt those who fail to honor financial commitments? Talia tilted her head. Perhaps our professions are not so different. On Azura, I adjudicated trade disputes between planetary systems. Wait, you're some kind of space judge? A diplomatic arbitrator, she corrected. Though my duties have been suspended during this political transition. Drake poured another drink, offering one to Talia, who sniffed it suspiciously before declining. So what exactly happened back there? Why did they think I was this bounty hunter? Talia sighed, a sound like crystal wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The translator must have conflated your profession with that of a bounty hunter. Recovery specialist, likely translated to retrieval operative in consortium standard language. And now I'm stuck with you until this blockade ends, Drake concluded. How long will that take? Days, perhaps. Or decades. Talia's violet eyes met his. Galactic politics are complicated. Drake's phone rang, startling them both. The screen showed his boss's name. Reality came crashing back. He still had a job, bills to pay, and now an unexpected houseguest from another planet. I need to take this, he said, stepping away. Try not to touch anything that might explode, please. As he answered the call, Drake watched Talia examining his refrigerator with the careful attention of a bomb disposal expert. Whatever came next, his life as a simple debt collector was definitely over. Wilson, his boss barked through the phone, did you get the Finch payment? Drake closed his eyes. About that, sir, there's been a complication. 3 days. It had been 3 days of Princess Talia transforming Drake's orderly bachelor apartment into what looked like the aftermath of a cosmic tornado. His bathroom was now cluttered with strange crystalline bottles and tubes of substances he couldn't identify. The kitchen had become a laboratory for her simple Azuran nutrition requirements, which somehow involved reconfiguring his microwave in ways that probably voided the warranty. Your employment seems unnecessarily tedious, Talia observed as Drake loosened his tie after returning from work. He'd been making excuses to his boss about the Finch case, buying time while figuring out what to do with his royal problem. On Azura, such financial matters are handled by automated systems. Well, here on Earth, we still need humans to deal with other humans who don't want to pay what they owe, Drake replied, collapsing onto the couch. Speaking of which, any progress on contacting your people without getting us vaporized? Talia's expression shifted, the crystalline patterns on her skin dimming slightly. I've managed to access a secure communication channel using your primitive internet infrastructure. The news is concerning. Something in her tone made Drake sit up straight. Concerning how? The blockade is not a simple diplomatic matter as I was led to believe. Talia began pacing, a habit Drake had noticed when she was agitated. It appears I was deliberately sent to Earth and placed in your custody as part of a political maneuver. I'm going to need more than that, Drake pressed. Talia stopped pacing and faced him directly. My father, King Vexer, was deposed 3 lunar cycles ago by my uncle, Dravik. I was to be escorted to our allies in the Pleiades system, but our diplomatic vessel was intercepted. I assumed the consortium was providing neutral protection. But they weren't? The officials you met were not consortium representatives at all, but agents of my uncle, disguised to deceive me. Her violet eyes flashed with anger. They needed me off-world but alive as insurance. By placing me with an oblivious human, they assumed I would be contained yet untraceable. Drake ran his hands through his hair. So I'm babysitting an exiled princess whose uncle committed treason. Great. Just great. The situation is more dire than that, Talia continued. Since I've accessed the communication channels, they'll be able to trace my location. Both my uncle's forces and loyalists to my father will be coming for me. As if on cue, a high-pitched whine filled the air, and Drake's windows began to vibrate. Talia's eyes widened. They've found us already. She grabbed his arm with surprising strength. We need to leave. Now. Wait, what? Drake's protest was cut short by the sound of shattering glass in his bedroom. He'd never moved so fast in his life, yanking Talia toward the front door. They burst into the hallway just as a blinding flash erupted from within his apartment, followed by the acrid smell of ozone. What the hell was that? Drake gasped as they raced down the stairwell. Molecular disruptor, Talia replied calmly, as if discussing the weather. Non-lethal variant designed for capture, not elimination. My uncle still needs me alive. They reached the ground floor and Drake pulled her toward the parking garage. "My car's this way." "A vehicle with combustion propulsion?" "Primitive but perhaps useful for its unpredictability." Talia matched his pace, her ceremonial attire now somehow transformed into something resembling Earth clothing, jeans and a simple blouse. Drake didn't have time to question the change. As they reached his 10-year-old sedan, the sound of footsteps echoed through the garage. 3 figures in sleek bodysuits rounded the corner, devices that were unmistakably weapons held at the ready. "Princess Talia of House Azura," one called out, voice distorted through some kind of mask. "By decree of Regent Dravik, you are to return with us immediately." Drake fumbled with his keys, heart pounding. "Friends of yours?" "Mercenaries," Talia whispered. "Krellian bounty hunters. Actual bounty hunters, not debt collectors." "The difference seems academic right now," Drake hissed back, finally getting the door unlocked. They scrambled into the car. The lead mercenary raised his weapon. "Exit the primitive transport vessel immediately." Drake turned the key and the engine roared to life. "Hang on," he warned Talia, then slammed the accelerator. The sedan lurched forward, tires squealing, forcing the mercenaries to dive out of the way. One fired, and the rear window exploded into tiny glass fragments. "Head east," Talia instructed as they burst out of the garage onto the street. "There's an enclave of non-terrestrials living among your population in a place called Atlantic City. They might provide sanctuary." Drake swerved through traffic, checking the rearview mirror. "There are more aliens on Earth? Living in Atlantic City of all places? Your planet is considered a primitive but useful neutral zone," Talia explained, bracing herself as Drake took a corner too sharply. "Various species maintain hidden outposts here. The gambling establishments provide excellent cover for interstellar currency exchange." A sleek black vehicle appeared behind them, moving with impossible speed. Drake's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "So you're telling me the slot machines at the Tropicana might be operated by aliens?" Talia gave him a look that suggested his priorities were questionable. "Is that really your most pressing concern right now?" The black vehicle drew closer, its front end beginning to glow with an ominous blue light. "You're right," Drake conceded, swerving onto the highway entrance ramp. "First we outrun the alien death squad, then we worry about extraterrestrial casino operations." For the first time since they'd met, Talia smiled, a radiant expression that momentarily transformed her features. "You handle crisis well for a mere financial recovery agent, Drake Wilson." "Yeah, well," Drake replied, pushing his overmatched sedan to its limits as they raced toward Atlantic City. "Collecting from deadbeats in Newark develops a certain skill set." The black vehicle was now directly behind them, the blue glow intensifying to a blinding brilliance. "Brace yourself," Talia warned, reaching into her pocket and pulling out what looked like a lipstick tube. "This might get interesting." Drake had seen Atlantic City before, the glittering casinos, the boardwalk alive with tourists, the peculiar mix of wealth and decay that defined the famous gambling destination. But he'd never seen it like this. There, Talia pointed toward what appeared to be a rundown motel several blocks from the main strip. The neon sign reading, "Starlight Inn," flickered pathetically, half its letters burned out. "That's the entrance point." They had narrowly escaped their pursuers when Talia's lipstick tube had emitted some kind of electromagnetic pulse that disabled the mercenaries' vehicle. Drake's sedan had suffered collateral damage, the electrical system was fried, forcing them to abandon it and take a bus the rest of the way to Atlantic City. "That dump?" Drake questioned, eyeing the motel skeptically. "It looks like the kind of place that rents rooms by the hour." "Appearances are the perfect camouflage," Talia replied, leading him across the street. Her regal bearing looked comically out of place against the seedy backdrop. "Your species tends to ignore what doesn't appeal to your aesthetic sensibilities." The motel lobby was deserted except for an elderly man behind the counter, his face buried in a newspaper. Without looking up, he spoke as they entered. "We don't have any vacancies." Talia stepped forward. "We seek sanctuary under the Proxima Accords." The newspaper lowered slightly, revealing eyes that reflected light in a distinctly non-human way. "Identification?" Talia held out her wrist, where the crystalline patterns in her skin glowed briefly in a complex sequence. The clerk's eyes widened. "Your Highness," he whispered, immediately standing and bowing deeply. Now Drake could see that what he'd taken for age spots on the man's skin were actually small scales. "We had heard rumors of your exile, but—" "The situation is urgent," Talia interrupted. "We're being pursued by Krellian mercenaries." The clerk, or whatever he actually was, moved with surprising speed, locking the front door and flipping the sign to "closed." He gestured for them to follow him through a door marked "Staff Only." "I should warn you," Talia said quietly to Drake as they followed, "non-terrestrial enclaves can be overwhelming for humans encountering them for the first time. After the past few days, I doubt anything could." Drake stopped mid-sentence as they stepped through the door. The shabby corridor they should have entered was instead a vast, gleaming concourse teeming with beings of every conceivable form. Some looked nearly human, others were so alien that Drake's mind struggled to comprehend their shapes. The space itself seemed to extend far beyond what the physical dimensions of the motel should allow. "Spatial displacement technology," Talia explained, noting his stunned expression. "The enclave exists in a pocket dimension anchored to your reality." "Right," Drake managed weakly. "Of course it does." Their guide led them through the crowded concourse. Conversations in dozens of languages filled the air, while holographic displays flickered with what appeared to be news broadcasts from across the galaxy. Drake caught glimpses of what looked like shops, restaurants, and even what might have been a school. "There are thousands of them," he whispered to Talia. "Living right under our noses." "Your planet hosts refugees from over 70 star systems," she replied. "Earth's political insignificance makes it ideal for those seeking neutrality." They were brought to a chamber where several beings waited around a circular table. One stepped forward, a tall, elegant figure with features that reminded Drake of a cat. "Princess Talia," the being purred in accented but perfect English. "I am Nixar, coordinator of this enclave. Your presence honors us, though the circumstances are troubling." Talia inclined her head. "Thank you for your hospitality, coordinator. This is Drake Wilson, a human who has been." She paused, "instrumental in my continued safety." Nixar's feline eyes assessed Drake with obvious curiosity. A human with security clearance is unusual. His neural patterns suggest he was not prepared for our existence. "He's adapting admirably," Talia said, with a glance at Drake that might have held a hint of pride. "The situation is complex. My uncle's agents are actively pursuing us, and I have reason to believe my father's loyalists may also be converging on this location." The assembled aliens exchanged concerned looks. One, a bulbous creature with multiple appendages, gurgled something that sounded alarmed. "Vexlor is correct," Nixar nodded. "We cannot risk becoming entangled in Azuran politics. Our treaty with your people grants sanctuary for 24 Earth hours only." Drake stepped forward, surprising even himself. "With all due respect, isn't a princess worth more than 24 hours? From what I understand, her uncle staged a coup. Doesn't that violate some kind of interstellar law?" The chamber fell silent. Talia touched his arm in what might have been a warning, but Drake continued. "Look, I'm new to all this, aliens, space politics, pocket dimensions in motels, but I've spent enough time with Princess Talia to recognize that she's someone worth protecting. She's smart, resilient, and frankly, probably a better leader than the uncle who's hunting her." Nixar's expression was unreadable. "You speak boldly for a species that hasn't even achieved unified planetary government." "Maybe that gives me perspective," Drake countered. "I'm a debt collector." My job is to hold people accountable for their obligations. Seems to me that if you have treaties with Azura, you have an obligation to the legitimate government, which would be Talia's father, not the uncle who overthrew him. Talia was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. The assembled aliens murmured among themselves. Finally, Nixar spoke. You argue surprisingly well, human. While we cannot directly intervene in Azuran affairs, we can extend sanctuary to 48 hours and provide communication channels to contact potential allies. That's all we ask, Talia said quickly, before Drake could push further. As they were led to quarters where they could rest, Talia pulled Drake aside. That was either incredibly brave or foolishly reckless, she said quietly. Drake shrugged. I deal with people trying to dodge responsibility every day. Your uncle sounds like the galactic version of the worst deadbeats I chase, taking what isn't his and refusing to pay what he owes. Talia studied him for a long moment. When we first met, I dismissed you as a primitive captor. I see now I was mistaken. She placed her hand on his arm, the crystalline patterns in her skin glowing softly. You would have made an excellent diplomatic arbitrator on Azura. High praise from a princess, Drake smiled. So what's our next move? Talia's expression grew serious. We have 48 hours to form alliances, gather intelligence, and formulate a plan to confront my uncle's forces. The fate of my world may depend on what we do next. No pressure, then. Drake looked around at the alien enclave hidden within the heart of Atlantic City. You know, a week ago my biggest problem was convincing Mr. Finch to pay his overdue loan. And now? Now I'm helping an alien princess reclaim her throne. He shook his head in disbelief. My boss is definitely not going to accept this as an excuse for missing the weekly collection targets. For the second time, Talia smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her otherworldly features. When this is over, Drake Wilson, I promise your employer will receive payment with substantial interest. Down the corridor, a commotion erupted. Aliens scattered as a group of armed figures burst into the sanctuary, neither the mercenaries who had chased them earlier nor more disguised agents of Talia's uncle. Royal Guard of Azura, Talia whispered, tension evident in her voice. My father's loyalists. They've found us. Drake sighed. I'm guessing they're not here to escort you home for a happy reunion? In times of civil conflict, even those who claim loyalty can have their own agendas. Talia's hand moved to the hidden pocket where she kept her disguised weapons. Be ready for anything. As the guards approached, weapons at the ready, Drake found himself standing protectively beside the princess. Somehow, in the span of a few chaotic days, collecting a debt had transformed into something far more important, protecting a friend. The Royal Guard of Azura, 6 imposing figures in crystalline armor that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, formed a semicircle around Drake and Talia. Their leader, a stern-faced warrior with elaborate facial markings, stepped forward. Princess Talia of House Azura, he announced, his voice resonating with formal authority. By order of the Resistance Council, you are to be escorted to the secure facility on Earth's moon immediately. Talia's posture shifted subtly, her regal bearing becoming even more pronounced. Drake had spent enough time with her now to recognize when she was adopting her diplomatic persona. Commander Vexith, she acknowledged coolly. I was unaware that my father's loyalists had established a lunar base. Recent developments required discretion, Your Highness, the commander replied. His gaze shifted to Drake with obvious disdain. This human must remain here. The security protocols. Mr. Wilson comes with us, Talia interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. He has proven himself a valuable ally and has insight into the situation that may prove useful. Drake kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he was both touched by her defense and terrified by the prospect of traveling to the moon. Debt collection definitely hadn't prepared him for extraterrestrial travel. The commander looked like he wanted to object but instead offered a stiff bow. As you wish, Your Highness. However, we must depart immediately. Our intelligence suggests that Regent Dravik's forces are converging on this location. Nixar stepped forward. The Enclave's defensive protocols have been activated, but I agree with the commander. Your presence endangers everyone here, Princess. Then we shall leave, Talia conceded. She turned to Drake. Are you prepared for this? Once we depart Earth, the dangers increase exponentially. Drake thought about his apartment, now probably destroyed by alien weapons. His job, which he'd likely already lost after disappearing for days. His normal life, which had vanished the moment he'd walked into that warehouse. I'm already in too deep to back out now, he said with a half-smile. Besides, I still haven't collected on that debt. Talia's eyes softened momentarily before she turned back to the commander. We are ready. The journey to the lunar base was a blur for Drake, a disorienting experience involving what Talia explained was phase-shift transportation rather than conventional space travel. One moment they were in the alien enclave, the next they were stepping into a vast underground complex beneath the moon's surface. Welcome to Outpost Helios, Commander Vexith announced as they entered a large chamber where dozens of aliens, all Azurans, Drake presumed, worked at control stations. The last stronghold of the legitimate government of Azura in this solar system. Talia surveyed the operation with a critical eye. Impressive for a facility established so quickly. How many loyalists escaped the coup? 3,000, Your Highness. Mostly diplomatic staff and their families who were off-world when your uncle seized power. The commander gestured to a large holographic display showing what appeared to be a star map. We have supporters in 6 star systems, but your uncle's blockade has prevented coordinated resistance. A new voice spoke from behind them. Which is why your retrieval was essential, Princess. They turned to see an older Azuran approaching, his crystalline patterns faded with age, leaning on an ornate staff. The entire room fell silent, and the commander snapped to attention. Chancellor Zorav, Talia breathed, genuine surprise in her voice. I believed you were captured during the coup. Your uncle underestimated the loyalty of my security detail, the Chancellor replied with a thin smile. Though escape came at great cost. He studied Drake with undisguised curiosity. And this is the human bounty hunter who inadvertently disrupted everyone's plans? Debt collector, Drake corrected automatically, then wondered if it was appropriate to correct an alien chancellor. To his surprise, Zorav laughed, a sound like wind through crystal chimes. A fortuitous mistake that may have saved the princess from all factions, including, I regret to inform you, Your Highness, some among your father's supposed loyalists. Talia's expression hardened. Explain. The Chancellor gestured for them to follow him to a private chamber off the main room. Once inside, he activated a device that created a humming field around them. Privacy shield, he explained. What I must tell you cannot be heard by all. His ancient eyes fixed on Talia. Your father is alive, but imprisoned. Your uncle rules as regent, claiming that King Vexer is incapacitated and that you, the heir, have abandoned your duties. Preposterous. Talia exclaimed. I was forced into exile. Indeed, but perception shapes reality in politics, Zorav said gravely. Meanwhile, certain factions among your father's supporters believe that with both you and the king removed, a council governance would better serve Azura, with them at its head, naturally. Drake had heard enough political maneuvering in his time chasing wealthy debtors to recognize the situation. So she's caught between 3 groups, her uncle who wants her as a puppet, loyalists who want to use her as a figurehead, and rebels who want her out of the way entirely? The Chancellor bowed slightly to Drake. Succinctly put, debt collector. The princess has few true allies left. Talia paced the chamber, her mind visibly working through the problem. Then we must change the equation. If my uncle's primary claim to power rests on my absence and my father's incapacitation, we must disprove both. Easier said than done, Zorav cautioned. Your uncle controls all communication channels to Azura. Any message from you would be intercepted and altered. Drake had been quiet, letting the aliens discuss their political crisis, but suddenly something clicked, a strategy he'd used with particularly difficult debt cases. What about a public forum, he suggested. All eyes turned to him. When someone really doesn't want to pay, sometimes the only leverage is public pressure. If Princess Talia could address her people directly, bypassing the usual channels. The Chancellor stroked his crystalline beard thoughtfully. The Galactic Consortium's annual assembly is in 3 days. All civilized systems will be monitoring the proceedings. If the princess could appear there, with proof of her father's condition. My uncle's representatives will be there, Talia realized, excitement building in her voice. They couldn't prevent my testimony without violating consortium law. It would be dangerous, Zorav warned. Your uncle's agents would try to stop you before you could speak. Then we'll need a distraction, Drake said, warming to the plan. And I think I know just how to create one. The next 72 hours were a flurry of preparation, with Drake drawing on every negotiation tactic and psychological strategy he'd learned in debt collection. His plan was audacious but, as Talia pointed out with newfound respect, just crazy enough to work. When the day of the consortium assembly arrived, the grand chamber on the neutral planet Centauri Prime was filled with representatives from hundreds of worlds. Regent Dravik's delegation sat prominently near the front, their expressions smug and confident. None of them noticed when Drake, disguised as a Centaurian service worker, slipped into the chamber and positioned himself near an emergency exit. The session began with the traditional protocols, dignitaries making ceremonial statements that Drake tuned out while watching the chronometer on his borrowed alien device. Right on schedule, alarms blared throughout the chamber. Security breach in the eastern quadrant, announced an automated voice. All security personnel report immediately. As Dravik's guards hesitated, torn between protecting their delegation and responding to the alarm, Drake activated the second phase, a small device that released harmless but impressive sparks from the podium. Chaos erupted. Delegations scattered in confusion, and in the commotion, a side door opened. Talia entered, flanked by Chancellor Zorav and Commander Vexith, with a frail but dignified figure supported between them, King Vexer himself, rescued from his imprisonment during the distraction Talia's loyalists had created on Azura. Before Dravik's stunned delegation could react, Talia had reached the central communication hub. Her voice, amplified by consortium technology, reached every corner of civilized space. People of Azura, citizens of the Galactic Consortium. I am Princess Talia, daughter of King Vexer, who stands beside me today. She spoke with passionate conviction, her words carrying the weight of truth. We have been victims of treachery, but we stand before you now to reclaim our rightful place and restore justice to our world. What followed was the most impressive negotiation Drake had ever witnessed. Drawing on skills honed through centuries of diplomatic tradition, Talia systematically dismantled her uncle's claims to power, presented evidence of his crimes, and offered a path forward that promised reconciliation rather than retribution. By the time consortium security had contained the situation, the damage to Regent Dravik was irreparable. Representatives from other worlds were already pledging support for the rightful rulers of Azura, and Dravik's own delegation, seeing the shifting political winds, were distancing themselves from their leader. Hours later, in a private chamber provided by the consortium, Drake watched as Talia embraced her father, their first reunion since the coup. Your plan was masterful, she told Drake when she finally broke away. Who would have thought debt collection tactics would translate so effectively to interstellar politics? Drake shrugged modestly. The principles are the same: leverage, timing, and understanding what the other party values most. Your uncle valued his reputation and legitimacy. Once those were threatened publicly, his power crumbled. King Vexor, still weak but lucid, studied Drake with interest. "My daughter tells me we owe you a great debt, Mr. Wilson." "Just doing my job, Your Majesty," Drake replied with an awkward bow. "Collecting what's owed." The king smiled. "And so you shall. When we return to Azure and restore order, you must name your reward." Drake hesitated, suddenly aware that his old life on Earth seemed impossibly distant now. "Actually, I've been thinking about that. I might be in the market for a career change. Any chance Azure needs someone with experience in, let's say, persuasive negotiation?" Talia's eyes lit up with that now familiar crystalline glow. "As it happens, the position of Earth Ambassador to the Azuran Court is currently vacant. It requires someone with knowledge of both cultures, diplomatic instincts, and—" She smiled, persistence in the face of resistance. "Sounds perfect," Drake said, returning her smile. "Though I should probably tie up some loose ends first." 2 weeks later, Mr. Gareth Finch, the original target of Drake's collection efforts, was startled by a courier delivering an ornate package to his warehouse office. Inside was a receipt showing his loan paid in full, along with a handwritten note. "Mr. Finch. Your debt has been settled with interest. Consider it a gesture of goodwill from the Royal House of Azure. Regards. Drake Wilson, Ambassador to Earth." Attached was a business card unlike any Finch had ever seen. It seemed to shimmer with colors that shifted as he turned it, and bore a symbol reminiscent of a crystalline crown. Far above Earth, aboard a spacecraft bound for Azure, Drake stood beside Princess Talia on the observation deck, watching his home planet recede into the distance. "Having second thoughts?" she asked, noticing his contemplative expression. Drake shook his head. "Just thinking about how I went looking for a few $1,000s and ended up finding a whole new world instead." He turned to her with a grin. "Best collection job of my career." Talia's laugh echoed through the chamber, a sound Drake had come to treasure. "I think we can safely say, Mr. Ambassador, that this particular debt has been repaid in full." The end.